Hi, this is Ryan Zeitz with NJ4S.
Hi, I'm Brenda Anderson with NJ Forest.
Today we're going to be talking about suicide prevention. Just a little background on me. I'm a licensed social worker. I've been working with in the field for about 10 years, working with populations from the severely mentally ill to inner city youth, and now working with children and families in Burlington County.
I'm Brenda. I'm an LCSW. I too have been in the field for about 10 years, and I have worked with youth, adolescents, and their families in Burlington County.
So, our learning objectives today. First, we're going to be breaking the stigma. So, just addressing the elephant in the room, talking about why it's so hard to talk about suicide and mental health. Then we're going to be identifying the risk and protective factors to help it make it easier for you all to understand what leads some students to suicidality. We're going to recognize the warning signs. So we're going to help you recognize the red flags to look out for to indicate that a student may be going through something challenging. And then we're going to talk about how to respond when a student is displaying these red flags. And then we'll talk about some helpful resources to help improve your ability to respond to students' mental health issues.
So the big elephant in the room, the awkwardness, it's uncomfortable, and today we're here to figure out why does suicide awareness matter. So this topic can be very difficult, intimidating, and uncomfortable to talk about. It may hit home for a lot of us. You or someone you might know, or someone that you might be working with may have thought about suicide, may be currently thinking about suicide. Maybe somebody you know has died by suicide or made a suicide attempt. So this is a very heavy and a very real topic that we want to try and hopefully break the stigma on. Talking about it will not make someone do it. If those thoughts are already in that person's head, that is there. Us bringing up the conversation, mentioning the word suicide or wanting to kill yourself is not going to give somebody a light bulb moment. So it is more common than we may think. A lot of people don't want to talk about it and don't want to bring it up because they feel uncomfortable. So our job is to be mindful of our comments, what we might be saying. There's always somebody listening, there's always ears and eyes watching, especially when we're working with students. So if we're making comments along the lines of, I have so much to do, when I get home, I'm just going to kill myself, or I'm going to hang myself, or I wish I was dead, we now become an unsafe person because we are making light of something that is very real and very serious for somebody. So just trying to avoid that language. Knowing that you can make a difference. We are all important. We all touch many, many lives that we probably do not realize that we are touching. Just smiling at somebody in the hallway, handing somebody something, opening the door, holding the door for someone can make a huge difference in someone's life, even if we don't know what their name is, if we don't have classes with them, if we don't work with them, that matters in some people's lives. So just expressing kindness and gratitude and being empathetic and being there and being present can make a huge difference in someone's life.
So, that elephant in the room, its name is stigma. Stigma is not exclusive to suicide. Stigma is the negative bias, preconceptions, or just the bad vibe around certain topics. For example, politics, religion, sex, mental health, basically anything that we would feel uncomfortable talking about around the dinner table is a stigmatized topic. In order to reduce stigma around these topics, we need to be able to talk about these things calmly and in a healthy manner. By continuing to have conversations about mental health and suicide prevention, we are making it easier and less uncomfortable to discuss these topics. That's what we're doing today. So, some statistics to share with you. Suicide is the third highest leading cause of death for adolescents and transition age youth. That's around 18 to 21. 1 in 3 students will experience mental health issues. That has increased by 10% in the last 10 years. One of the contextualizing factors is COVID-19, which kind of took 2 or 3 years of our lives and significantly impacted the mental health of the entire world. Statistics for mental health and suicidality are higher for marginalized communities. We'll talk about that in a little bit. 46,000 people died by suicide in 2020, and youth between 14 and 24 accounted for 14% of those deaths. And then 20% of adolescents seriously considered suicide, and 9% attempted suicide in 2020. The most important statistic is not on the screen right now, and that is the number 3. In September of 2024, there were 3 deaths by suicide in Burlington County alone. All of these students went to school in Burlington County and had people around them who could have identified the warning signs and may have been able to address this before these tragedies happened. Together, we can turn that number to 0.
So speaking of suicide, we want to be mindful of the language that we use. It is very common, and many of us, we too, still have trouble switching that language because it's so common. So we are going to start saying died by suicide instead of committed suicide. That is the most common thing that we hear, that we try to educate people on the switch for. Somebody that has a physical illness and has passed away, we don't say that they committed cancer. They died by cancer. Suicide, even though it is not a physical illness, it is a mental illness that makes somebody want to do that. We're also going to avoid saying successful or completed suicide because we do not want the person to be successful. We do not want them to complete it. So therefore, we don't want to glorify it for people that may be having those thoughts. We're going to say suicide attempt instead of failed or unsuccessful suicide, because people that are thinking about suicide and are attempting it already are most likely having thoughts that they are a failure, that they are unsuccessful. And therefore, if they have attempted and not died, then they hear that language, they're just going to add to their pile of stuff of feeling like a failure and that they can't do anything right. And lastly, we're going to use suicidal behavior instead of a suicidal gesture. Most of us talk with our hands and make gestures all the time. We don't want to minimize what somebody is feeling and experiencing. If someone has attempted suicide, then they are very serious about that. They weren't just making a gesture about it.
So some more definitions and language to start using. Non-suicidal self-injury. This is another way of saying self-harm. Self-harm is usually when a person uses some sort of blade to create skin deep or superficial cuts in their skin to relieve pressure and to cope with the negative mental health issues they're going through. Generally, this is done on the wrists, the arms, the stomach, or the legs, somewhere that is easily concealed for the person. Suicidal ideation is a term that we're going to throw around quite a bit today. It's a fancy way of saying that somebody is thinking about suicide. They're having ideas about suicide. When we respond to students who are experiencing suicidal ideation, it is our job then to gather more information about their suicidal plan and means. That is exactly what it sounds like. It is the who, what, where, when, why, and how of their suicide. The more detail that somebody has about their suicidal plan, the greater the suicidal intent. When we gather information about a suicidal plan, we are gathering information about how much intent or how serious this person's suicidal intent is. The more information, the greater intent, the greater at risk that person is.
So before we continue with today's discussion, we just want to be mindful of checking in with your family, your friends, colleagues, just your loved ones, people that you care about, and also including yourself on that list. This is a heavy topic, but it is very real and it is very important to be aware of what might be happening within yourself or those people that you care about. So if you notice any of these symptoms in yourself, or you start recognizing it in somebody that you care about, we're encouraging you to check in and just kind of see what's going on. Start a conversation, maybe have a conversation with a friend or a family member. If you notice that they're just kind of isolating a little bit more, you notice yourself isolating a little bit more, disconnecting, not having interest in doing things, maybe having more thoughts or questions about death or how to die, just that overall emptiness, numbness. Maybe it's a bad day, but maybe it's extends into a week or a month, and that's when you want to start being mindful of those signs. If you start noticing anything, some things that you can do is know that you're not alone, that there are people that care about you and love you, and maybe they're unsure of how to reach out. So maybe you being that person that reaches out to a friend or a family member could be really helpful for them. If you're struggling yourself, checking in with your friend, checking in with a friend, a family member, a mental health professional, your doctor, or just taking a day for yourself where you get out in nature or participate in a hobby that you really enjoy. You can call or text one of the helplines that we will have provided at the end of our presentation. So we want to give just a little scenario of what this might look like for you while you're interacting with any of your students. Most of the time when we think about suicide, we think about people that are isolating themselves or just seem really low and empty and just in a dark place. But that's not always necessarily the case. It can also be the role model student, the person that is involved in everything and seems like they have it all. So our example today is Allie is well liked by her peers and her teachers. She is a model student, but she puts tremendous pressure on herself to succeed. We often encourage our students to engage in extracurricular activities for continuing education if they want to go to college. All of these things are good, but we have to be mindful of how each person handles that and if they're feeling overwhelmed and how they're internalizing all of these different things that are coming at them. So the people in Allie's life do not recognize that her success could be be a part of a larger threat to her well-being. Allie tried out for her school soccer team, but she gets overwhelmed with anxiety and sometimes uses a small pocket knife to make cuts on her stomach to relieve the pressure. Allie is at risk for suicide. She unfortunately did not make the school soccer team, so that feeling of overwhelming got stronger. She felt disappointment and self-hatred for herself. Allie later said, I couldn't stop thinking about how I'm useless, and I thought that my family would have an easier life if I weren't here. So when Allie got home, she decided that day to take a bottle of pills to end her life, which almost every single household, all of our houses have this easily accessible in our homes. After taking a few pills, Allie realized that she did not want to die. Most people that make a suicide attempt and have not passed away all report that they never actually wanted to die. They just felt like they have exhausted all of their resources and still were not feeling better and just couldn't bear it anymore and felt like that was their only option. Allie thankfully called her parents for help. They took her to the local emergency department and Allie is okay. So, what if Allie said this to you? I can't stop thinking about how I'm useless. My family would have an easier life if I weren't here. Our job today is to hopefully make you feel more comfortable if a student or somebody comes up to you with thoughts like this. So just like when we're on the bus or the train going to the city, whatever that might be, and they say, if you see the black suspicious bag, that you should report it. Same thing in this scenario. If you see something, if you hear something, then we're encouraging you to say something. We understand that this might not be easy for every person. So if you're unable to say something or approach the student or the person exhibiting these behaviors, then we encourage you to report it to somebody that could approach that person. You are with these students a lot. You know their moods, you know their mood swings, what's happening, what's going on. If something seems different, if it looks different, then reach out to them, say something. It's better to ask and check in and be wrong than to not have said something at all.
People ask us all the time, well, what do I say to somebody who is experiencing these things, or how do I comfort them? The easiest answer to that is to empathize and validate. What does that mean? If Allie comes to you and says, I'm feeling useless and I don't want to be here anymore, you can say, I understand that sounds really hard. I'm sorry you didn't make the soccer team. I know that you really wanted to. By validating her feelings and empathizing with Allie, we're making her feel seen and heard, right? That she's not alone and that she's not crazy or a bad person for having these thoughts and feelings. So we want to empathize and validate. One of the things that we want to take into consideration is that suicide is never the result of one thing. For example, Allie was overwhelmed with school success and school pressures, and she had a bunch of different factors leading to her suicide attempt. It wasn't just one thing. It was a culmination of several different factors acting upon Allie. It is never just one trigger that leads to suicide. Another way of thinking about who is at highest risk for suicide is by using Joyner's model of suicide risk, where he identifies the point in the middle of several different factors for identifying who is at highest risk. Some of these factors include perceived burdensomeness. One of the things that we hear as clinicians is that a student doesn't feel like they can ask for help from their family because, oh, well, mom has a really hard job and I don't want to put anything on her, or, I don't want to put my feelings on my friends, or, everybody else has a lot of stuff going on and my stuff doesn't really matter. If a student feels like they cannot ask for help or that they're already a burden, they're less likely to ask for help. Thwarted belongingness. We work with students who are adolescents who are going through one of the hardest social periods of their whole lives. This is where they're forming their identity. They're figuring out what makes a good and a bad friend. They may not have found their community or their people yet. When a student doesn't feel like they belong in their community, they don't feel like they have anybody to ask for help. That includes their family, their friends, their classmates, their church, whatever community they belong to. If they don't feel like they belong in that community, they won't access that community for help. And then finally, acquired capacity for suicide. On the surface, this sounds like acquired capacity for suicide is whether or not a student has access to means for suicide. But what we're really looking at is whether or not the student has acquired the mental capacity for suicide. Suicide is a painful and violent act. If a student has gathered up the willpower to do it, to hurt themselves, and they don't feel like they can ask for help from anybody in their community, or they feel like they're a pain in the butt to their family and their friends, that is a student that is at the highest risk for attempting suicide. Another thing to keep into consideration is the racial and cultural disparities for suicidality and access to mental health resources, especially within marginalized communities. When we talk about marginalized communities, we're talking about the Black, Indigenous, and people of color community, the LGBTQIA community, that's lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, questioning, or queer, intersex, and asexual community. Students who are experiencing gender identity where they're not quite sure where they belong on that spectrum. Students who are experiencing chronic disability. All of that combined relates to intersectionality and the different roles and identities that students wear on a day-to-day basis. Students and people who identify as being part of these marginalized communities often experience misdiagnosis or medical malpractice when they go to their general practitioners, leading to mistrust within these communities and these practitioners. They're less likely to ask for help because of the medical trauma and the medical mistrust that they have. Inequity within these communities. There are not a lot of culturally competent service providers in our areas that are receptive to these members of these communities. There is the stigma. Some members of these communities have cultural and religious norms that go against accessing mental health care. So accessing mental health care may not be an option in those communities. And then finally, trauma. For people in these marginalized communities, trauma plays a huge factor in whether or not they've asked for help before or their willingness to ask for help in the future. What we can do differently is we can, one, acknowledge these marginalized communities and how difficult it is for them and the cultural differences between us and people within these communities. That is called cultural competence, where we recognize that there are cultural differences between us. The other thing is humility, cultural humility, recognizing that we have blind spots that we're not quite aware of, and being open to learning about how we can address people within these marginalized communities.
So that brings us to our risk factors. So with that being said, our risk factors are what research shows the most common things that we should look out for, and that puts somebody at higher risk for attempting suicide. But somebody could check off all of these and have never thought about suicide before. Somebody might have none of them or very few of them and think about it all the time. So each situation, each individual, just like Ryan was saying, with culture and the different communities, is going to be unique. So every person is going to have their own experience with this. But on an individual level for risk factors, having a previous suicide attempt or engaging in non-suicidal self-injury or self-harm puts us at a higher risk. If we have already gotten to the point where we could attempt suicide or we have self-harmed, then we are more likely to be able to engage in it again. Having any type of chronic illness or pain, anything that is physically happening in our body. Our mind and our body are very, very much connected. So if there is something going on physically, it's going to affect our headspace. If something is going on in our headspace, it can cause physical ailments. So if somebody is suffering without being able to get relief from physical pain, that could put us at a higher risk for wanting to attempt suicide. Trauma, or ACEs, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, which are stressful events in a child or adolescent's life. So something that would occur before the age of 18. They are very, very common, and most Americans have one. There is a list of 10. Experiencing any of these can cause a lasting and cumulative effect on our mental health, but we view them as normal because most of us have experienced some of them. So some examples of them would be domestic violence, physical, mental, or emotional abuse or neglect, family with mental health or substance use, separation or divorce. So experiencing any of those in our lives can increase our risk factors. So that leads us again to mental illness, whether we have it ourselves, a history of it, or just experiencing it in our upbringing. Having a sense of hopelessness and just feeling like there is no way out, and we've exhausted all of our resources, we've tried everything and nothing works. Being a victim, witness, or perpetrator of violence. We're human beings and we are not meant to experience violence. Some of us experience it and are engaged in it more often than we should be, and that's hard for our body to understand and process and cope with. Substance use. If we are under the influence, we are more likely to engage in risky behaviors. So maybe something we wouldn't feel comfortable doing, we would then engage in if we are under the influence of something. And then there's screen time, which we know we all hear a lot about now. There's a lot of good about screen time, but there can also be some negatives. Related to this topic, some negatives could be that social media is portraying and glorifying suicide to be a positive thing, maybe encouraging somebody to want to think about it more. Also, it's hard for us as adults to know the difference between reality and what is just on social media and what is happening. So our students and our adolescents are comparing themselves to all of these things that they are seeing on social media, which most of them are not realistic. And then they are expecting their lives to look that way when in reality that it's not really true. So they're almost setting themselves up for failure. At the relationship level, that could increase the risk factor if there is a family history of suicide. If it could be a whole nother presentation, but mental health can be passed down through genetics. So if that's something that's happening in their family and they've been exposed to, it could increase their risk factor. If there's any type of pressures at home, extra responsibilities, again, not that that is necessarily a bad thing. We want to teach kids emotion regulation and boundaries and responsibilities, but sometimes they might then be putting too much pressure on themselves, almost like what Allie was feeling. Any type of abusive relationship where they're just in a toxic cycle and they feel like they don't have a safe place to go or a safe person to talk to, and it's just kind of up and down turmoil. Having conflict or disagreements with loved ones, whether that's in their family or with friends or people that they care about, just that feeling of walking on eggshells and not knowing what they're going to get, or somebody that they really love and care about that's disappointed in them can kind of start to turn internal and have negative self-thoughts. If someone they love has passed away or been diagnosed with an illness, not knowing how to manage life or handle their emotions without that person there. Loss of relationship doesn't just have to be about someone passing away. It could be somebody that has moved. It could be changing grades and no longer with their favorite teacher, a coach moving, a mentor no longer being there, their best friend that they've been best friends with since kindergarten is now no longer friends with them, and they have to sit in the cafeteria and watch that person have fun and be friends with another group of people and not knowing why they're not a part of it anymore. Bullying, which includes cyberbullying as well. Bullying isn't like it was in the old days where you left school and it stopped. It can get spread and 3 schools over know about it in 0.5 seconds. The students might also not know who's bullying them if it's happening online and they feel like they have no escape. Isolating themselves, feeling very lonely, just kind of disconnecting and feeling like they have nowhere to turn can all be increased risk factors. On the community level, if somebody is feeling discrimination or cultural barriers, those can increase their risk factors as if they feel like they're not connected and they don't have the support. If there is a history of violence or there is current community violence, that can also increase their risk factors. As we mentioned before, if there's limited access to resources, somebody may be wanting to get help, but maybe stuck in barriers, whether it's related to their race or their culture and their own family views or community views. Or if there's just not the capability to get somewhere because of scheduling, transportation, or insurance, then these people that are feeling like they want help and they can't get it is just kind of another risk factor that's holding them back. Moving or adjusting to a new area, that could be switching classes, having a new teacher. Change is good, but change can also be really scary and intimidating while we're adjusting to that new period. So even changing bedrooms in the same house can be a big adjustment and something that we have to manage our emotions with. if there have been any recent suicides in the community or just somewhere in the world or wherever their community is. And then if there's unsafe media portrayal of it and it's getting glorified, then people are starting to think, hey, like I want to belong, I want to be popular, I want to be seen, I don't want to be invisible. And that can increase the risk factor because they may think that it's something that they should do because it's becoming glorified. And lastly, the easy access to lethal means. This one is a scary one because a lot of people have lethal means in their house, or students know how to access them in relatives' house or friends' houses. 85% of youth who died on their first attempt used a firearm. So going back to what we said before, most people that have attempted suicide don't actually want to die. They just want the physical and emotional pain that they're feeling to end. So if their method of choice is lethal means, then it is more likely that they will die by suicide.
Okay, so now let's talk about the warning signs. These are the explicit red flags and signals that you can be keeping an eye out for with your students and the people that you love that may indicate that they are moving closer to suicidal ideation. So being isolated and withdrawn or not being as involved, you may see a student who was very social, very talkative, suddenly stop wanting to engage in these social activities or participate in class or participate in practice. That can be a warning sign. Giving or throwing away possessions. For students who have decided that they would like to take their own life, they're not going to need their physical material possessions. And it can be a meaningful practice to give their things away to the people who they care about. Preoccupation with death. I often hear about parents who are concerned because the student may like horror movies or death metal music or something like that. That is not the kind of preoccupation that we should be concerned about. The kind of preoccupation with death that is more associated with suicidality is asking about death often, about the mechanics and specifics about what happens when you die, what happens after you die, what happens to bodies when they commit suicide or they pass on. And then another red flag is when a student often writes about death in their school assignments. So it's a lot of talking about death and researching death. Changes in eating, sleeping patterns, and personal appearance. This may indicate any other kind of mental health issue that's underlying that may contribute to suicidality. Looking for a way to access lethal means. Again, if a student is looking for a gun or for some sort of substances that can be legal, we want to address that head on. We don't want to wait for a student to find those things. We want to, if we hear or overhear a student talking about wanting to access a gun, we have to address it as it happens. Substance use and risky behavior. Brenda mentioned earlier that increased substance use may reduce inhibitions and lead to things that a student wouldn't normally do if they were sober. Another thing to take into consideration is that many substances can act as painkillers. As we said before, suicide is a painful and violent act. So if a student is under the influence, their inhibitions are lowered, so they may do things that they normally wouldn't, and their pain tolerance has increased. They're at significantly higher risk for attempting suicide. Acting out or getting in trouble. This is a warning sign because for some students, they may not know how to ask for help. They may not know that that's an option. They may just want to get attention from an administrator or an adult who can give them attention or that can give them the help that they need. They just don't know how to get into that person's office. So acting out may be a covert way of getting the help that they need. And then missing school, missing classes, leaving early and coming in late may be a sign of an underlying mental health issue or any kind of health issue. Some of the emotional warning signs. Depression. So if we see a student who is feeling down, they're isolative, their energy and motivation have significantly reduced is a warning sign. Emotional dysregulation, so students who are kind of quick to anger or quick to being agitated. Strong mood swings are a warning sign. Increased anxiety and worrying. Feelings of overwhelming guilt, shame, and rejection. The bottom line with these emotional things is that you guys are seeing these students for hours a day, many days a week. If you notice a student is acting strangely, they're acting off, or they're just not being themselves, it doesn't hurt to check in and just ask how everything is going. You might be the only person who asks that question. Finally, sudden cheerfulness. I find this to be very scary because if a student is down in the dumps and having a whole lot of issues, and then the next day it's like a switch flipped and they're doing wonderful now, that may indicate that the student has made the decision to end their life. They know when, how, and where they're going to do it. And they're looking forward to it. They're happy with the decision that they're making. When we talk about checking in with students, it's not always checking in when things are going bad. It's okay to mention that you've noticed that the student may have been off for the last few weeks and then all of a sudden things are good, and just acknowledging that. Normalizing talking about emotions and how students are doing is a significant protective factor, something that we can do to reduce suicidality in the people that we love. So some verbal warning signs. These particular ones are for adolescents and older. So direct verbal warning signs include explicitly talking about wanting to die, wanting to take their own life. There's no real way to misinterpret these statements. They're things like, I don't want to live anymore. I've been thinking about ending my life. I'm going to kill myself. No way to misinterpret these statements. Indirect statements can be a little bit more passive aggressive, or they may be asking you to read between the lines for what they're saying. For example, you'll be better off when I'm gone. I wish I could disappear. I just want all of this to end. So vaguely alluding to death or not wanting to be alive anymore, or making veiled threats that they will end their own lives. For younger students, verbal warning signs can look a little bit different. Direct statements in younger students may look like indirect statements from older students. For example, a direct verbal warning sign for a younger student may be, I don't want to be here anymore. I want to go to sleep and never wake up. I'm not going to be here anymore. This may be because a younger student may not recognize that suicide is an option, or that death is something that they can achieve. For younger students, indirect warning signs are a little bit harder to recognize. It can be alluding to not wanting to be alive anymore. For example, it was a mistake to have me, so I wish I was never here to begin with. They may start complaining about somatic issues or physical health issues like stomach aches, headaches, aches and pains. This may be a misinterpretation of mental health symptoms, or it might just be that they're having anxiety headaches, or they're feeling nauseous because of the mental health symptoms that they're going through. And they may start to think about what the life would be like if they weren't around or if they weren't alive anymore. For example, what would it be like if I wasn't here, or what would the world be like without me? These look different because a lot of these younger students don't have the vocabulary to express suicidality or to express their emotions. So checking in and talking with students who are younger is still just as important as with the older students.
So that brings us to our protective factors, which are that invisible line that kind of holds a person back from wanting to follow through with making a suicide attempt. So again, just like everything else, these are going to be unique for each individual and could look different, But these are what research shows is the common ones. So if somebody has a sense of purpose, if they are talking about the future, even if it's a week from now or tomorrow, or it could be 10 years from now, just some goals and things that they are looking forward to doing futuristically. Positive self-concept or a strong cultural identity, even if they're struggling right now and having a really hard time or feeling kind of low, if they generally accept themselves, know who they are, and appreciate what their identity is and feel comfortable with it. Having an internal locus of control, knowing that they have a say and not everything is just up to fate, that they can learn from their mistakes, that they can keep going, and that they have control over what could be happening next. Being able to ask for help is hard. So, like Ryan was saying before, it could look a little different than flat out saying, hey, I need help with this. But if they can ask for help in any way for any kind of topic, maybe just for something that they need to do better in practice or for homework, that is showing that they have the skills to be comfortable and confident to be able to do that. Having life skills, positive coping skills, and resilience, knowing that it's okay to fall down and get back up and learn from our mistake, that failure is not an option. We're going to keep going. They're learning these things from watching you guys. You guys are their positive role models, their mentors. You are showing them this by example, not necessarily just verbalizing it, but modeling it for them. And then there's physical health. Again, our body and our mind are very much connected. So if we are taking care of our physical body, if we are getting up, moving, exercising, getting our blood flowing, keeping our cortisol levels a little bit lower, then we're able to manage our anxiety a little bit better and other mental health things that are going on as well. At the relationship and community level, if a person feels that they have safe spaces, whether it be at home, in their community, at school, if they just know where they can go to feel their emotions and not be judged. They have positive relationships with friends, teachers, coaches, mentors, classmates, family members, just having support, whether it's from their created family or their blood family, gives us a sense of belonging and knowing that people care about us. Us as educators and therapists and counselors working in school systems and working with adolescents, if we can promote that culture of caring, checking in with somebody, saying hello, being kind, and walking in the hallways and smiling, asking how your day is, letting people know that they're not invisible and that they are seen and that they are cared about. Being connected. As human beings, we just want to fit in somewhere. We want to belong. We want to be accepted for who we are. So if we can just create that sense of feeling, and if somebody has that sense of feeling, it is a huge protective factor. And you guys are super important. You can make a difference. You matter. And you're there for these kids and these adolescents and helping them navigate a tricky time in their life.
So what does suicide prevention look like? First, access to resources. When we talk about resources, the first thing that comes to mind may be mental health care, but resources are much more broad. It may be access to physical health care, like a general practitioner. It may be access to a gym where you can improve your well-being by being fit and exercising. It might be access to fun activities, or things to do. It might be access to education. When we talk about access to resources, it's a lot more broad than we initially think about on the surface. Awareness and education. We can prevent mental health issues by talking about them and having those conversations and educating ourselves and the people around us about what that means and how, about what mental health issues are, how we treat them, right? And then just being frank about what we're dealing with and normalizing those conversations. We can reduce the stigma by having those conversations frequently. Community engagement. A huge protective factor for anybody is being part of a community and having things to do and getting out of the house and being surrounded by people who are interested in similar things. For example, we have a lot of coaches and athletic folks in the audience. Sports are a huge protective factor for students because they're exercising and they're part of a team and they're part of a community and they have people who are looking out for them. Joining a church or getting a job or going to extracurricular activities, those are huge community engagement protective factors. School-based programs. So these would be, again, the extracurriculars, people who are looking out for them at school, social emotional learning, and NJ4S can help bolster those school-based programs as well. And then training, what you guys are doing right here, right now, by paying attention to this, you are part of the solution to preventing suicide. So why don't some people report suicidal ideation?
Some say I might do something wrong.
When responding to a student who is expressing suicidal ideation, you might make a mistake, and that's okay. Being there and doing what's right for the student and what's best for the student is all that really matters, right? Protecting the student is the best thing that you can possibly do. Also, you have a team around you. You have people that you can work with. You don't have to do this alone.
This isn't my responsibility.
While it is true that you may not be as well versed in these kinds of things as somebody like a guidance counselor or a nurse, you're still part of the team. The student trusted you enough to come to you for help. It's our responsibility to help that student. That's our job.
I am violating the student's trust.
When working in the schools, we actually find that students who come to us for help feel comfortable asking for us for help in the first place. And by responding in a way that makes the student feel safe, heard, and validated, we find that this actually builds trust a whole lot more. So you're not violating the student's trust by getting them the help that they're asking for.
But they're already receiving services or therapy.
Just because a student is already receiving services and therapy doesn't mean you don't have to report it. As therapists, we're only in the school or we're only working with our clients for 1 hour a week. You may be seeing them for several hours all day, every week or every day. We may have a session with a student, and then later that day they express suicidal intent, and we're not able to address that until a whole other week. We can't be everywhere at once. We need help, and you can help us.
But the student won't do anything.
So we don't know that. We have to err on the side of caution. This student may be asking for help, or this, may be crying out for help. And that's exactly what it is. It's our job to help them, even if they may not be serious about wanting to hurt themselves. Similarly, it's not a big deal. It could be a pretty big deal, right? We don't want this to turn into a big deal. We do not want to be the person who a student came to for help, we didn't do anything, and then they went home and hurt themselves. Not only is that going to weigh pretty hard on our conscience, and it's just kind of morally the wrong thing to do, but we may open ourselves up to legal and professional ramifications for not acting. When we work in a school, we're a mandated reporter, so we need to act when these things occur. It's better to err on the side of caution than to not do anything.
DCP&P or the police will get involved.
Brenda, in the last 10 years in working with students in the school, when you've had students who are expressing suicidality, have you ever had DCP&P or the police involved with a case of a student expressing suicidal intent?
Never.
DCP&P or the police will not get involved unless a parent is made aware of the student's suicidality and they refused to act accordingly. So if a parent doesn't get the student cleared or assessed by a crisis screener, or they don't get the student help the way that we're instructing them to, you will not get involved with DCP&P at all.
But the student's parents will get upset, or the student might get in trouble once they get home.
We hear this more than anything else. We understand that mental health is still a stigmatized topic and not all parents are open to getting help. However, I would much rather deal with the student's parents being upset than having a dead student on my hands. So we have to weigh which one is more important. Some of the language that we can avoid when talking with students include things like, well, at least you have a roof over your head and food in your stomach. Well, yeah, I've got all the things that I need, and I still feel like I want to kill myself. This is very dismissive. We could have everything that we ever need and still want to hurt ourselves. Think about Allie from the vignette earlier today. Everything will be okay. I know you don't mean that. This is temporary. These things may all be true, but in the moment when a student is coming to you for help, everything is not okay. They do mean this. And despite it being temporary, it's happening right now. And right now, I'm in a lot of pain. I need your help. Promise me you won't do anything. This statement puts more responsibility on the student. You're putting your own feelings ahead of the student's need for help. So we don't want to add any more to the student's plate. And then finally, we don't want to make casual remarks about suicide. Just before recording this, I saw a meme that if X, Y, and Z happens, then I'm going to blow my brains out. That trivializes suicide. So we want to make sure that we are removing these references to suicide from our language.
So that brings us back to Allie and figuring out how could we have helped her if she made that statement to us. So what would that look like? It kind of brings us back to that elephant in the room. And hopefully now we can pull from the elephant's strength and wisdom and concept of representing family so that we can respond to this person without feeling as awkward and uncomfortable. Hopefully you'll be able to stay calm and actively listen, just like we tell our students to do. We're going to put the phone away. We're going to walk away from the laptop and the computer or the phone that's ringing and pay attention to the kid that is in front of us, the student, the person, whoever it may be, and really listen to them and empathize with what they're saying, validate their feelings. You guys have a little bit of homework today, sorry, but you have to figure out what it is that you need to do. How do you fit into this role? What is your school's protocol? And how do you report it and seek help with that student? So remembering to be transparent and letting the student know, like, hey, I'm really glad that you came and told me about this. This is what the next steps are going to look like, and we are going to figure it out together. Make sure, if you take nothing away from today, that you know that you always have to stay with the student. If a student expresses any type of suicidal ideation, whether it's passive or indirect or direct, you have to stay with them. You're not leaving them with a trusted student or anybody else that you might know, unless it is another trusted adult that you work with. So language to use could sound like, thank you for coming to me. That sounds really difficult. We can get through this together, showing them that you have a culture of caring, that they're not in this alone. This may be the very, very first time that this person has said anything like this out loud. It's really hard for it to be floating around in our head, but it's even harder for somebody to verbalize it. So just encouraging that relationship and letting them know that you really appreciate the fact that they came to you and told you about it. Telling them what the next steps are. Let's go talk to the guidance counselor, the principal, the assistant principal, and figure out how we can get you support. Some ways to help yourself feel more comfortable with this. We have a few acronyms that you guys can use that will hopefully make it a little bit easier. The first one being ask. So ask directly. Be very transparent and blunt with them. Are you thinking about suicide? Do you have a plan? Remember, it is okay to say the word and ask directly. It's not going to plant the idea in their head if they were not thinking about it. Also, remember that if you ask, are you thinking about hurting yourself, is very different than if they are wanting to kill themselves. So it would be good to ask both of those questions to determine whether they're thinking about suicide or just self-injurious behaviors. Support them by validating their feelings and ensuring that they are not alone, letting them know that you care about them and that you will help them through this process as much as you can. And keeping them safe by following whatever your school protocol is. So that means that you have to find out what your role is in this protocol. So this way, if a student ever comes up to you with these comments, you're not trying to figure it out while they're there in distress with you. Then there's apps. You can approach and acknowledge the person. Try and tolerate your own anxiety, your own awkwardness. Again, if you're not able to have this conversation with somebody because it's too triggering, bring them to another trusted adult or staff member that would be able to do it. Be specific about what you notice. Hey, I heard you saying this, and get clarifying information. Maybe we were wrong. Maybe we misheard something out of context, but it's better to check in and again show that culture of caring. Probe, show that you care by asking questions, again being specific about suicide or self-harm. Promoting hope by actively listening and paying attention to what they are saying and not being distracted by everything else that is going on. And sharing referrals, figuring out what your school protocol is and how you can create that safety net and resources that you can share to get that student help. So what happens next? Again, it's going to look different for each school and each person in that building, but typically whoever the student reports it to will then bring that student to their guidance counselor, administration, principal's office, SAC counselor, CST worker, whoever that might be. And that person would then conduct a screening tool to screen for what the suicidal intent is that we were talking about before. So whether it's mild, moderate, or severe, so that we know what the next steps are. Is that the student is getting sent out to another screening level to determine if there needs to be a higher level of care or community care put into place. Regardless, the student's parent or caregiver will be called to make them aware of what is happening. And then we just kind of take it from there and see what the next steps are. But again, you're not leaving the student alone. We don't know what they may have on them. We don't want to leave them alone if they're feeling scared and isolated. We want to show them that we are supporting them, we care about them, and that we're figuring this out together as a team.
So the following are some resources that we can share to help you address a student who is in crisis, who is experiencing suicidal ideation. We're going to share some phone numbers with you guys. You cannot use these phone numbers and call them on behalf of the student. These resources need to be given to the student and their parents, and they can call. So the first is 988, the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. You can call or text this number. I like to think of this as 911, but for mental health emergencies. It's available 24/7 and it's pretty accessible. That's 988. The next is second floor youth helpline. Again, you can give this to the parents or youth for them to call or text. It is 1-888-222-2228. And again, it's 24 hours as well. The National Suicide Prevention Hotline. This is the national hotline. It's open 24 hours a day as well. And this one is in Spanish and in English for students who may not speak English very well. In New Jersey, we have a bunch of exclusive mental health resources that you can access with the student or the parents can access for the student. The New Jersey Prevention Helpline, 1-855-654-6735. Again, that's just another number that you can call to access mental health resources in a crisis. Perform Care. Perform Care is New Jersey's one-stop shop for all mental health resources. Not only can you call Perform Care and request mental health resources for students who are under 18, we can use this in a crisis. We can call Perform Care after a student has expressed suicidal ideation and ask for a screening and crisis intervention program. Oftentimes, when a student has expressed suicidal ideation at a school, the next step is that they will have to be cleared by one of these programs. In Burlington County, we have SCIP, which is located in Mount Holly. Fortunately, now these programs can do telehealth. So at home, they can do a telehealth video chat or phone call screening to assess whether or not the student needs a higher level of care. Another resource which is accessible through Perform Care is Children's Mobile Response. This is a great resource for children who are in a crisis but are not a harm to themselves or others. For example, if a student is like trashing their home, they're throwing things, they're breaking things, they're having a crisis, but they're not an explicit threat to themselves or other people, we can call Children's Mobile Response, and a mental health professional will come out to the house that night, assess the situation, and refer to ongoing longer-term care. So again, we can access this screening and crisis prevention intervention program and Children's Mobile Response through Perform Care. Another hotline that you can call is the Trevor Project. This is more geared towards LGBTQ youth. Trevor was a student who took his own life, who was a member of the LGBTQIA+ community. And so his father created the Trevor Project to prevent more youth from that community from harming themselves. So that is 1-866-4U-TREVOR, or the trevorproject.org. And then finally, the Society for Prevention of Teen Suicide. This website is not something to access in the middle of a crisis, but rather has a lot of psychoeducational tools, handouts, worksheets, all those kinds of things to reduce the stigma, to educate yourself and your loved ones about mental health and how to respond and how to take care of yourself.
So that brings us back to self-care. And speaking of self-care, as well as our resources, although these resources are something for you to provide to the family, of course, if you're experiencing it yourself, you can use any of these hotlines, but also know that just helping somebody through this type of situation can be traumatizing for ourselves. So you too can reach out to 988 for support for yourself. They also have a great blog on there that you would be able to access too. But to conclude, taking time for yourself is important. We did mention it in the beginning. We have to make sure that we're pouring back into our own cup. It doesn't mean that we have to take a day off of work or dedicate an entire day to self-care where we go to the spa and put cucumbers on our eyes, but we can stop for that extra cup of coffee, or we can use our favorite mug, or we can put the windows down and blast the radio on the way home. Maybe taking a little bit of extra time in the shower or to get ready in the morning, going for a walk, getting out in nature, engaging in your hobby, doing something that maybe you've been putting off doing, just making sure that you really truly are taking time for yourself and not forgetting about you.
We want to thank you for your time and attention. You guys can make a huge difference with your students and the people in your life now that you have the skills to recognize the warning signs for suicidal ideation, and you know what to do if a student or a loved one comes to you for help, or if you need help. If you have any questions, you can feel free to email us. Our information is on the screen. Again, I've been Ryan, and I've been joined by Brenda from NJ4S Burlington County. We appreciate your time. Thank you.